Do one thing for me. Close your eyes and remember the last time you unwrapped a bar of Cadbury dairy milk. The purple foil peeled back at the corner, the soft snap of the first square, the way it melted, slowly, on the tongue, sweeter and creamier than it had any right to be. Maybe you were a child. Maybe it was a birthday, or a Christmas stocking, or a hospital visit, or just an ordinary, gray Tuesday afternoon. For the better part of a century, across most of Britain and much of the world, this was not really a chocolate bar. It was childhood. It was comfort. It came with a promise you had heard 1,000 times, without ever once thinking about it, a glass and a half of full cream milk in every bar. And it was made by a company that felt as British as rain and tea and the Queen. Now take a leap forward to the winter of 2010, and that same chocolate, that little purple piece of British childhood, no longer belonged to Britain. In what felt, to a whole nation, like a single night, it had been swallowed whole by an American food giant that most British people could not have named the week before. A company a single Quaker family had built, patiently, stubbornly, brick by brick, bar by bar, across 186 years, was, quite suddenly, gone. This is the story of that family, and that chocolate. Of how you build something over nearly 2 centuries, a factory, a village, a promise to your workers, a taste an entire country grows up on, and then watch it change hands in a matter of months, and change forever in a matter of days. This is World's Richest. And here, we do not just tell you how great things are built, we tell you how they are broken. If this is your first time on the channel, subscribe. It is completely free. And today, the whole story. From a shop counter in Birmingham to a boardroom that sold a nation's childhood. But now, stop, because this story is not nearly as simple as it looks. You are already thinking you know the shape of it. A rich foreign company came along and bought a beloved British one. That is just business. That is just capitalism. It happens all the time. And that is true. But underneath it sits a broken promise, a betrayed factory town, a prime minister who could do nothing, a parliament that could only hold hearings, and a question that Britain still argues about, more than 15 years later. To understand any of it, you have to go all the way back, to a shop and a family and an idea about how to be good. It begins in 1824. A young man named John Cadbury opens a small shop on a street in Birmingham. He sells tea and coffee and a new fashionable thing, drinking chocolate, which he grinds by hand, with a mortar and pestle, behind the counter. His shop is spotless. Its windows are said to be among the very first in the whole city made of clear plate glass, and he has them cleaned every single morning. And the reason for all that care is the single most important thing about this entire story. John Cadbury was a Quaker. In that England, Quakers were shut out, barred from the great universities, barred from Parliament, from the law, from the army, because they would not swear the required oaths and would not fight. So they poured themselves, instead, into trade and into banking, and they made a kind of religion out of honesty. A Quaker did not haggle. A Quaker set one fair, fixed price and held to it, take it or leave it. A Quaker did not water down his goods or cheat on the weight. And in an age when food was routinely poisoned for profit, flour cut with chalk, sweets colored with lead, that promise of purity was not a slogan. It was a genuinely radical thing to sell, and a Quaker like John Cadbury believed something else too, that the working men of Britain were drinking themselves into early graves on cheap gin and beer. He campaigned against it, in public, all his life, and chocolate was his answer. A warm, wholesome, honest cup to put in a man's hand instead of a pint. It is one of the strangest facts in the entire history of sweets, that the 3 great chocolate houses of Britain, Cadbury, Fry, and Rowntree, were every one of them built by Quaker families. To them, chocolate was never really a treat. It was a weapon against drink. But being good is not the same as being successful, and by the 1860s, the little firm was dying. John Cadbury, worn down and grieving, had all but given up. The workforce had shrunk from around 20 people to just 11. And here is where the founder steps back and the family steps forward, because this is the thing to hold on to about Cadbury. It was never one man, it was a dynasty. John handed the failing business to two of his sons, Richard and George, both barely into their 20s. One of them, Richard, the salesman, the artist, the one with the eye. The other, George, the maker, the disciplinarian, the one who ran the floor. Between them, for something like 5 years, they stared down bankruptcy almost every single week. They each poured in what would today be the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of pounds of their own money, rather than let their father's name die. And then they found the thing that saved them: a press, a machine, from Holland that could squeeze the excess fat out of the cocoa bean and leave behind something pure. A cleaner, richer, honest cup of cocoa, with nothing added and nothing hidden. They sold it under a line that was really just their whole faith, printed on a tin: absolutely pure, therefore best. And the country, at last, listened. The family firm did not just survive, it began, slowly, to soar. And what the brothers did with that success is the reason Cadbury became something more than a company. Because George Cadbury looked at how his workers lived, crammed into the filthy, smoke-choked slums of industrial Birmingham, and he decided to build them something better. In 1879, the brothers moved the whole operation out of the city to open green fields 4 miles to the south and built a modern red brick factory in the middle of the countryside. They called the place Bournville, a factory in a garden. But George did not stop at the factory. Starting in the 1890s, on more than 100 acres of land he bought with his own money, he built an entire village. Not a row of grim company huts, a proper village. By the turn of the century, some 300 cottages, each one with a real garden, big enough, deliberately, to grow your own vegetables. Tree-lined streets, parks, playing fields, a place where an ordinary factory worker could raise a family in fresh air, and light, and dignity. And the life inside that factory was, for its time, almost unimaginable. Hot meals in proper canteens, heated rooms to change in, sports grounds, and a swimming pool. Half days on a Saturday, long before the rest of the country. Committees, one for the men and one for the women, where any worker could take a complaint straight to the men who ran the place. Sick pay when you were ill, and in 1906, one of the first great private pension funds in the whole country that George paid for, out of his own pocket. This was decades before Britain had a welfare state of any kind. One family, in one factory, had simply built their own. And there was just one thing you could not find anywhere in Bournville: a pub, because the family that got into chocolate to fight drink was not about to sell it on their own doorstep. This was not charity. It was a belief that you could run a great business and be decent at the very same time. And to make sure it outlived him, George gave the whole village away, handing the land and the houses to an independent trust, so no future owner could ever cash it in. And then came the bar itself. In 1905, the firm launched a new kind of milk chocolate, with far more milk in it than anything a rival made. Sweeter, smoother, meltier, they called it dairy milk, a name suggested, so the story goes, by a customer's young daughter over the stiffer options the company had drawn up itself. Within a few years, it was the best-selling chocolate in all of Britain. And in 1928, they gave it the promise that would follow it for the rest of the century: a glass and a half of full cream milk in every half pound. Say those words to almost any British person, even now, even a century later, and they can finish the sentence for you. That is not marketing, that is memory. By the turn of the 21st century, Cadbury was not really a brand anymore. It was a national institution, nearly 200 years old, recognized by almost every single adult in the country, the second biggest chocolate maker on earth. A future mayor of London would call its chocolate the taste of British childhood. The newspapers called it a national treasure, and that word treasure is exactly why what happened next hit the country like a death in the family. Because here is the quiet, fatal turn, the crack that nobody outside the city of London really noticed. For decades, Cadbury had been half of a larger company, merged back in 1969 with the drinks maker Schweppes, fizzy drinks on one side, chocolate on the other, and that awkward two-headed size had, without anyone quite realizing it, kept Cadbury safe. It was too big and too complicated to easily swallow. Then, in 2008, under pressure from restless investors who wanted the parts worth more than the whole, the company split itself in two. It spun off the American drinks business entirely, and what was left behind was Cadbury alone. Pure chocolate, no fizzy drinks to complicate the accounts. Simpler, cleaner, and, though barely anyone said it out loud at the time, suddenly a perfect, bite-sized target. The analysts saw it immediately. A company this beloved, this exposed, with no ballast left to protect it, had been, in their cold words, vulnerable to a takeover from the very moment it split. And it was not only the analysts. A ruthless activist investor named Nelson Peltz had already been circling the share register for a couple of years, quietly buying up stock and pushing hard for exactly this kind of breakup. Long before Kraft ever appeared, the word in the city of London was that Cadbury was in play. The doors, in other words, had quietly been left unlocked. All that was missing was someone hungry enough to walk through them. That someone was Kraft. In September of 2009, the American food giant Kraft, then the second largest food company in the world, made its move. Its chief executive, a woman named Irene Rosenfeld, offered around 745 pence a share for Cadbury, a bid worth roughly £10 billion. And Cadbury's chairman, a man named Roger Carr, threw it straight back in her face. He called it, in a word that would define the whole fight, derisory, insulting. Far too low for a company that precious. But Kraft did not go away. Instead, it did the aggressive thing. In November, it went hostile. It took its offer directly to Cadbury's shareholders, over the heads of the board, daring the owners of the company to sell, whether the board wanted them to or not. And here is a small, strange detail that tells you how these deals really work. The formal hostile offer was now worth slightly less than the one the board had already called insulting. Not because Kraft had lowered it, but because part of the price was to be paid in Kraft's own shares, and Kraft's own share price had been quietly sliding. The prize was priceless. The currency being offered for it was getting cheaper by the week. Roger Carr fought it in the press, warning that a proud, creative British institution was about to be swallowed into what he called a low-growth conglomerate, a gray American giant that would strip out the magic and count the beans. The whole country took sides, and for a few weeks, it looked like Cadbury might just be saved, because rescuers seemed to appear. Two other chocolate companies, the American giant Hershey and the Italian family firm Ferrero, both let it be known that they were looking at bids of their own. White knights, the papers called them, who might swoop in and keep Cadbury out of Kraft's hands. But look closely, because this is where the fairy tale quietly dies. Neither of them ever actually made a firm offer. They looked, they hesitated, and they walked away. And then came the strangest twist of all, an attack on Kraft from inside its own house. Warren Buffett, the most famous investor alive and Kraft's single biggest shareholder, went public to say that Kraft was about to do something stupid. Not by buying Cadbury, exactly, but by how it planned to pay. Kraft wanted to print huge numbers of its own new shares to fund the deal, and Buffett thought those shares were cheap, a poor, weak currency to be spending on such a prize. He said, flatly, that if he could, he would vote no. Months later, he called it a dumb deal. But even the most powerful investor in the world, objecting from the inside, could not stop it. Because in the end, it came down to money, and Kraft simply raised its offer again and again until it reached around 840 pence a share, a total of roughly £11.5 billion. And at that number, the resistance broke. On the 19th of January 2010, Cadbury's board gave up the fight and did the one thing it had sworn it never would. It recommended the deal. It told its own shareholders to sell. And so understand this clearly, because it is the honest heart of the story. Cadbury was not stolen in the dark. There was no single night when men in suits seized the factory gates. It was a 5-month public battle, fought in newspapers and boardrooms, and it ended not with a robbery, but with a signature. On the 2nd of February 2010, Kraft gathered up just over 70% of Cadbury's shares and declared victory. That was the moment, not a night, a morning, in an office with lawyers. A few weeks later, Cadbury was quietly removed from the London stock market, and, after 186 years, an independent British Cadbury simply ceased to exist. The chocolate stayed the same. The purple foil stayed the same, but it belonged now to someone else. And Britain was furious. This was not just a company changing hands. It felt, to millions of people, like losing something that belonged to all of them. The government scrambled. A senior minister warned that anyone who thought they could come to Britain and make a quick buck would meet fierce opposition. The Prime Minister himself promised to protect Cadbury's roughly 6,000 British jobs. The unions called the deal an offence against the national interest. And when it was over, Parliament itself hauled the story in for questioning, a committee of MPs holding hearings on how a national treasure could be taken so easily. But the American chief executive who had bought Cadbury, Irene Rosenfeld, refused, reportedly 3 times, to cross the Atlantic and answer them in person. She sent deputies instead. By staying out of the country, she stayed out of reach. And the committee, insulted, said her conduct had come close to a contempt of Parliament itself. One member of Parliament called it, simply, a slap in the face. They wrote up their findings and their fury in a formal report. And then, nothing happened. Because a report was all they could do, it was a stark, humiliating lesson. A country could love a company with its whole heart and still be utterly powerless to keep it. And then came the moment that turned anger into something colder. Because there was one promise, above all, that Kraft had made. Cadbury had a historic factory at a place called Somerdale, near Bristol, and Cadbury itself had already announced, before any of this began, that it planned to close it and move the work abroad. Hundreds of jobs were on the line, and so, on the very day it launched its bid, Kraft had said something that melted a great deal of the resistance against it. It said it believed it could keep Somerdale open, save the factory, save the jobs. It was exactly what frightened workers and worried MPs wanted to hear. And then, roughly 1 week after the takeover was complete, Kraft announced that sadly, it had looked again, and the closure was simply too far along to reverse. Somerdale would shut after all, around 400 people would lose their jobs, and the work would go, in the end, to a brand new factory, in Poland. The last bar came off the Somerdale line the following winter. The gates closed for good a few months after that. The machines were shipped east. And the promise that had helped win the whole fight, had lasted about a week. Britain's own takeover regulator later ruled, publicly, that Kraft had breached the rules. That you cannot tell the public you believe something to win them over unless you have a solid, reasonable basis for saying it. Kraft had not. The betrayal was so raw and so total that the country rewrote its takeover laws because of it, a set of reforms still nicknamed to this day after the chocolate company that was lost. So, was it fair? And this is the honest, uncomfortable question, the one with no clean answer. On one hand, everything Kraft did was legal. The board agreed to it, and the shareholders who sold walked away with a fat premium. Far more than their shares had been worth just months before. That is how a public company works. If you do not want it sold, you should not have sold your shares. That is the cold, correct answer. But on the other hand, a promise was made and broken within a week. A factory town was gutted, a parliament was brushed aside, and a piece of a nation's identity, built over nearly 2 centuries on an idea about decency, was folded into the balance sheet of a company on the far side of the world. Is that good? Is that bad? You decide. But one thing is beyond argument. This is simply what the modern machine does now. A family firm with an ethic and a village and a soul becomes a single line in the snacks division of something enormous. And the enormous thing did not even stay still. Because barely 18 months after it swallowed Cadbury, Kraft turned around and split itself in two. It carved off its global snacks business, the part that now held Cadbury, and gave it a brand new, invented name, Mondelez. And here, be careful, because almost everyone gets this wrong. Mondelez did not buy Cadbury. Nobody bought Cadbury a second time. It was the same owner, simply relabeling itself and shuffling the pieces. The chocolate had not moved. Only the sign on the parent company's door had changed. And under that new owner, the small betrayals continued. A few years later, the recipe for a beloved Cadbury Easter egg was quietly changed. The good dairy milk shell swapped for a cheaper mix, and the country erupted all over again, because it tasted, to people, like the final proof of what they had feared all along. That something honest had been made a little cheaper. That the soul had been quietly optimized away, and over the years that followed, more of it drifted. More of the chocolate came to be made outside Britain. Recipes were tweaked, and shapes were shrunk, and each change was argued over as if it were a matter of state. And the quiet Quaker idea at the very heart of the thing, that a business could be pure and kind and profitable all at the very same time, faded a little further into history. Cadbury became, and remains, the single most famous cautionary tale in all of Britain, the story every politician reaches for whenever a beloved national company is put up for sale. So, the next time you unwrap a bar of dairy milk, stop, just for a second, before that first square melts. Because you are holding more than chocolate. You are holding the last, sweet trace of a Quaker family who believed you could sell something pure, and build a garden village, and pay a pension, and keep a promise, all at the same time. The foil is still purple. The taste is still, mostly, the taste you remember, but the hands that own it changed, in what felt, to a whole country, like a single night. And that is the quiet lesson underneath all of it. That no institution, however old, however loved, however woven into the memory of a nation, is ever truly safe. That what took 186 years to build can pass to a stranger in 5 months and be broken in 5 days. What that family built, Bournville, the pension, the village, the glass and a half, will be remembered for as long as anyone eats chocolate. And what Britain lost, one gray winter, will be remembered too. That is what World's Richest is for. Not just the shine on top, but the ground it was standing on. If tonight's story made you stop and think, then subscribe and send it to someone who grew up on this chocolate and ask them what they remember. You will be surprised how much they do. We will see you with another one very soon.